Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with EdWeek and initiate a dialogue, quite frankly, with colleagues and those who believe in the power of education across the country. You know, we started our digital convergence initiative, and not because there was this imperative to put technology in the hands of kids necessarily, but we followed the moral imperative that sought to eradicate the digital deserts across our district. So knowing that and knowing that technology has become an environmental tool, assistive tool to educators and students, it became a moral imperative for us to bring that environmental tool that would allow for 24/7, anytime, anywhere learning to the hands of students. That's why we passed back in 2012 a massive $1.2 billion bond referendum. The first $250 million of that referendum were invested in technology, and overnight, and the remaining were invested in school construction and renovation. We are prone to the wrath of hurricanes every season. And we perfected actually the process of shutting down schools and transitioning teaching and learning to a different modality. But I can tell you, I'll give you three things that really positioned us well prior to this crisis becoming the pandemic that it has become and hitting our shores. Number one, I spoke about it already. We passed this massive bond referendum, and the tools, the devices, the connectivity, and the digital applications that we needed were already in-house. By the way, used by teachers and students in the classroom environment. So that was done. The second thing is the fact that we did not wait for a federal mandate or an executive order from the state to prepare ourselves for what we knew would be coming. A priority for us was consider the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario would be 355,000 students would have to stay home, 48,000 employees would have to stay home, but teaching and learning must continue. By March, before we shut down, 2 weeks prior to shutting down the school system, not only did we have general agreement, we had conducted training for all teachers, we had provided resources for parents to provide the needed support for students in their own homes. We had began the device distribution, and obviously the end result was reaching 100% connectivity, student connectivity, meaning with exception of 400 students, we believe with their parents, they absolutely left the county. So they actually moved out of this community. Every one of our students had a device. Every one of our students was connected, as were our teachers. In the process of solving a digital equity issue by eradicating the digital deserts and empowering the students with the tools and accessibility, going back to 2012-13, we were able to seamlessly transition from traditional bricks and mortar teaching and learning to distance learning by simply flipping a switch. That position does very, very well. That's why we did not face the issue of equity that many districts across the country faced. And I read the statistics. I mean, many districts across the country at best reached a 50 to 60% connectivity, student connectivity. And that breaches the principles of equity. And that's why one of the most significant impacts that I believe we'll see will be this historic, unprecedented academic regression suffered by those who were in crisis prior to the crisis beginning. Students of color, poor students, English language learners, and students with disabilities. We've used surveys and polls actually with teachers, students, and parents for many, many years. In light of this crisis, we dedicated our survey ability to teachers and parents to really focus on what worked during instructional continuity plan implementation as a result of this crisis, what didn't work, what we needed to improve, the challenges and difficulties that teachers and parents encountered, and opportunities for improvement. We also surveyed parents and teachers regarding what next school year could bring and the individual challenges and circumstances faced by teachers and parents alike. Two of the challenges identified both by parents and teachers is the need for us to become more creative, smarter at in addressing the needs of specific student populations, English language learners and students with disabilities. There was overwhelming agreement in terms of information that we obtained from both parent and teacher groups that needed to happen. And by the way, that is a focal point of conversation right now with some of our private sector providers to develop solutions, better solutions, adaptive software that actually meets those children where they are, recognizes their disability or where they stand in terms of their English language acquisition process. The other point was the issue of engagement. So there were students who were struggling to begin with in the traditional classroom environment. They became even more unengaged. They would log into the platform, but their level of engagement was never satisfactory, which tells us that they logged in to satisfy a condition for attendance, but may not necessarily have benefited significantly from the experience. We made a decision to continue to teach content at all grade levels and subject areas. The only thing that changed was the geography. We were able to negotiate an accountability agreement with the teachers union that provided real requirements, a specific number of hours of teacher-student engagement, a specific amount of time of teacher-monitored, student-accessed digital content that was personalized and adapted. The recording of attendance picked up district-wide, but then overnight reports to principals and teachers with wellness checks, physical wellness checks at the door by social workers who work for the school system if there was a need. We were dealing with the data, quite frankly, allowed flexibility. This is a high flex model that teachers working with their students could work from. And sadly, what I see many districts doing is they actually begin a one-to-one discussion. They begin the process of digital equity conversations focused on the device, the sexiness of the device, the Surface Pad, the iPad. That is the wrong approach. So the reason why we went to a 2-to-1 versus a 1-to-1 is because we had data. We surveyed parents and students. We knew what the critical need was. And one of the most important questions was, which we asked again prior to the COVID-19 crisis school closure, was, do you have a device at home? What kind of device? What are the specifications of that device? Meaning, is it powerful enough to run our platforms and run our applications? Do you have connectivity? And what came back was actually that about 37% of our students did not. So we, prior to school closures, made the announcement we can roll out in excess of 200,000 devices in addition to hotspots. And we ended up distributing close to 120,000 devices and 11,000 hotspots because we knew that based on the survey data, we did not need to give every single student a device. Many kids in our school system already had their own devices. We were able to then redirect those resources, those dollars, towards the purchase of professional development, towards the purchase of investments in terms of human capital development, investments in the development of the Virtual Parent Academy, support for parents and students, because we did not have to put a device on top of 1, 2, or 3 devices that students already had in their home. That was an easy decision. This idea that everybody needs exactly the same thing actually breaches the concept of equity, because it is fundamentally driven by equal treatment for all, when quite frankly, some students have 2 smartphones, 2 laptop computers, and an iPad. Overnight, this crisis forced the nation to react to something that, to avoid the crisis, would have taken probably a decade to accomplish. And I think that happened in terms of education this time around. So the one-size-fits-all approach, I think, is dead. The old normal is gone. The new normal will force districts, now that they have by and large resolved connectivity, access, device problems, will force districts on the basis of parental demand to be more attentive and responsive to parents' circumstances and personal decisions on how best to teach their kids. Know your community. Know the perceptions, perspectives, challenges, difficulties, and expectations that your own workforce has and your parents and students have. That's why the power of surveying them is so critically important. Secondly, really recognize the challenges that you as a leader had in providing the resources needed to pivot quickly to this modality of distance learning. Third, really be courageous in taking advantage of this crisis and build an opportunity to really re-envision and redesign your school system, what it offers and how it offers and when. We will lead a lot of those efforts by really attempting to capture and bring back into the schools students who are not doing well through the virtual education experience. And we can do that. We know who they are. And then lastly, be really daring to craft the most complex element in this choice environment, which is the blended learning environment, the hybrid model, which requires alternate schedules, which complicates the process of transporting students, the process of scheduling students. But that is the expectation in our community for about 30% of our parents. I think that this is the perfect storm because of three factors. It began as a health crisis that has led to an economic crisis that then was followed by a social justice crisis, the likes of which this nation has never seen. You put those three elements together, they create a level of pressure that becomes difficult to navigate. And sadly, my biggest concern is that the students who've always been in crisis, the same ones that were disconnected to begin with, the ones who are children of the most impacted communities by this virus, those who have suffered the injustices of racism, of bias, of discrimination, are the ones who stand to lose the most. You know, out of crisis, out of tragedy, triumph can arise. And I really hope that we recognize what the tragedies have been, the health crisis, the economic crisis, the social injustice crisis. All these crises, these issues need to be addressed simultaneously, which adds a new dimension of the complexity that we're facing. But that does not mean it's not achievable. And this is time for us to accelerate actually towards the ultimate goal of having practices, policies, environments that dignify every single student, having conditions for learning that transcend the schoolhouse, but do not ignore the schoolhouse, having the guarantees of connectivity that are driven by equity and access to great educational programming, technology, and internet resources. And then the foundation for all of this, let's make sure that we train people adequately to navigate these new spaces. And I believe that despite the complexity that I just described of these issues, if we fail to do that, we will fail our kids.